The Mysterious Disappearance of Isabella Hellmann true crime documentary. The rain started just after dusk. It was the kind of storm that didn't seem to want to end. A constant heavy downpour, the kind that blurs the world outside. Isabella Hellmann sat at her desk, the glow of the computer screen reflecting off her glasses. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She had been investigating for days now. A missing persons case. But not just any case. This one was different. There was something off about it. The name was familiar. That was what kept drawing her back. The details didn't add up. The case had begun weeks ago, a quiet disappearance. But now, Isabella's mind raced as she sifted through the files. A name, a location, and then a pattern. Her eyes narrowed, trying to connect the dots. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She didn't like where this was going. She clicked on the next file. A photograph popped up on the screen. It was blurry, taken at a distance. But it was unmistakable. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The person in the picture was standing by a window. The same window she had passed earlier today. Her heart raced. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked to zoom in. There, in the corner, half hidden in shadow, was the figure of a man. A man she didn't recognize. A man she was certain hadn't been there before. Her mind started to spin. She glanced at the clock. It was late, too late for anyone to still be around. The house was quiet. Almost too quiet. Isabella tried to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. But it wouldn't go away. She turned back to the screen. The man in the photo was staring directly at her. It was impossible. The photo had been taken hours ago. She had been in the room at that exact moment. She had felt something, hadn't she? A shiver ran down her back. Isabella stood up quickly, pushing the chair away. The room suddenly felt much too small. The rain outside intensified, each drop louder than the last. It was then she heard it. A knock. Soft. Eerie. At the door. The room felt colder. Isabella's breath became shallow. Her eyes locked on the door. Her pulse quickened. Another knock. This time louder. More insistent. She couldn't move. Her legs felt frozen to the ground. She looked back at the screen. The man's face was gone, replaced by a black screen. And then, just as she started to turn toward the door, the power cut out. The entire house went dark. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. The knock came again. And this time, it wasn't just at the door. This time, it was coming from inside the house. A slow, deliberate sound. Each knock echoed through the empty halls. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Her heart thudded against her ribs. The silence that followed felt like a trap. The power was out. The whole house plunged into an oppressive darkness. She reached for her phone, but it was dead. Her fingers fumbled for the flashlight on her desk. She found it and clicked it on. The beam flickered weakly, casting shadows across the walls. Every corner seemed to move. Every breath felt too loud. Another knock. Closer this time. Isabella froze. Her eyes darted around the room. The door was still shut. The knocking came from the other side. She didn't know how she knew, but she could feel it. Someone was in the house. The sound of feet shifting on the floor. Something scraped against the wall. A faint whisper of breath. Her pulse quickened, each beat thundering in her ears. Isabella took a slow step back, her hand clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The knocking came again. And then, the floorboards creaked behind her. She spun around. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Was it a draft? No. Someone was here. She could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps, too faint to trace. Isabella's breath was shallow, panicked. She moved toward the door, slowly, cautiously. The beam of her flashlight caught something. A shadow, at the edge of the hallway. A figure. She gasped, a strangled sound escaping her. But as quickly as the shadow appeared, it was gone. Her mind raced. Was it real? The knock came again. The door rattled this time. Someone was trying to get in. Isabella couldn't think. Her legs moved on their own, backing away. She reached for the nearest object, anything to defend herself. A vase. A lamp. Anything. Her hand shook violently. There was nowhere to hide. Her only option was to face whatever or whoever was out there. But in that moment, a chilling thought crossed her mind. What if this had nothing to do with the case? What if this wasn't about the missing person at all? What if it was about her? The thought froze her in place. What if it was about her? She had been digging into something far deeper than she'd realized. The missing person. It wasn't just a random case. Was it a warning? Her grip on the vase tightened. The room seemed to close in around her. The knocking had stopped. But the silence was more terrifying than any sound. Isabella's breath came in short, shallow bursts. The air felt too thick to breathe. She dared not move. She could hear the faintest creak of the floorboards outside her room. Someone was moving, stalking her. The shadows in the hall seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The flashlight flickered again, dimming with each second. Isabella's fingers trembled, but she held on to it. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to leave, but her body refused to obey. Suddenly, the power surged back. The lights blinked on, harsh and unforgiving. Isabella squinted, her eyes adjusting to the sudden brightness. She had just enough time to see someone standing in the doorway. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a man. His face was obscured, his features hidden in the dim glow of the hallway light. Isabella could feel the weight of his presence. The chill in the room thickened. The air tasted like metal, sharp and cold. She couldn't speak. The words were trapped in her throat. The man took a step forward, his boots scraping against the floor. Another step. And then, his voice broke through the silence. "I've been waiting for you, Isabella." His tone was low, steady, and calm, unnervingly calm. A cold shiver ran down her spine. How did he know her name?
He took another step.
Isabella's grip on the vase faltered, her pulse racing in her ears. Who was this? How had he gotten in? She was suddenly hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. The distant rumble of thunder outside. The erratic thumping of her own heart. His voice came again, a whisper this time, like it was in her ear. "You should have stopped looking." She took a step back, eyes wide, panic rising in her throat. "Who are you?" she managed to choke out. The figure remained silent, his face still shrouded in darkness. But Isabella could see something now. A faint glimmer of something reflective. A symbol. A mark etched into his sleeve. It was the same mark she had seen in the case files. The same symbol connected to the missing persons case. Her breath caught. This was no coincidence. The man was part of it. But part of what? What had she uncovered? The symbol on his sleeve burned in her mind. It wasn't just a logo. It was a message. A warning. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced, trying to piece it all together. She remembered the note. The cryptic note she had found in the missing person's belongings. A single phrase written in ink that didn't look quite right. Asterisk, "You should have stopped." Asterisk. Her throat tightened. The same words. The same chilling tone. The man stepped forward again, his face still hidden in shadow. He didn't move quickly, his movements were deliberate, measured. Every step he took made the hairs on the back of her neck stand straighter. Isabella swallowed hard. "What do you want?" she forced herself to ask, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer at first. He just stood there, watching her, waiting. The room seemed to shrink with each passing second. The only sound was the erratic beat of her heart. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Then he spoke again. "You're asking the wrong question." Isabella's eyes widened. He wasn't just threatening her. He was playing with her.
But why?
What did he know? Her hands shook, but she couldn't let go of the vase. She had to keep something between herself and him. "You know about the case," she said, voice steadying just enough to challenge him. "What is this? Some kind of game?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile, though she couldn't see his face clearly. "It's not a game, Isabella." His voice was like ice. "It's a warning. And you've crossed the line." A sinking feeling washed over her. Crossed the line? Her thoughts scrambled. What had she uncovered? What had she done? He took another step closer. Now, the beam of her flashlight caught a glimpse of his face. But it wasn't the face she expected. It wasn't human.
It was a mask.
Pale, smooth, and completely expressionless. A mask that seemed to swallow the light. Isabella staggered backward. Her mind screamed, but her body wouldn't respond. The man tilted his head slightly. "I warned them, you know," he said, voice soft. "But you never listen." She couldn't speak, couldn't move. The flashlight trembled in her hands. "What do you want from me?" she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. His smile widened. Then, in a voice that sent a jolt of terror straight to her bones, he said, "To make sure you never leave." Isabella didn't have time to react. Before she could even take a breath, the man lunged forward. A blur of motion. Too fast. The flashlight flew from her hand as she stumbled back, the edge of the desk biting into her side. She hit the floor with a sharp thud, pain radiating up her spine. Her head spun, dizziness clouding her vision. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. But then she heard him. His footsteps were closer now. The air felt suffocating. She tried to scramble to her feet, but her limbs felt like lead. And then, something cold and metallic touched her throat. She froze. The silence returned, deafening. The man was standing above her, his mask looming like a nightmare. The feeling of the metal against her skin burned. It was a knife. Isabella's eyes filled with fear. Her thoughts went blank. Was this the end? Or was this just the beginning? The man's voice broke through the silence again. "You've been asking the wrong questions all along, Isabella. Now, you'll learn the truth." And in that moment, she realized with chilling certainty. She was about to find out exactly how deep this web of secrets went. The cold metal pressed harder against her throat. Isabella's breath was shallow, each inhale a struggle. Her mind raced, but her body refused to obey. Everything around her felt distant, muffled, like she was trapped underwater. The man's presence loomed, suffocating, all-consuming. Her hands gripped the floor beneath her, trying to steady herself. The knife in his hand glinted ominously in the dim light. She swallowed, the movement sharp and painful. "Why me?" she managed to croak, her voice barely audible. The man didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, the silence hanging thick between them. Then, as if savoring her fear, he leaned in closer. His breath was cold on her cheek. "I told you," he whispered, his voice like poison. "You should have stopped." Her eyes searched his masked face, desperate for any sign of who he was, what he wanted. But there was nothing. No identity, no humanity. Just a void behind the mask. Her pulse thudded in her ears as his grip tightened on the knife, the cold edge pressing deeper into her skin. The pain was unbearable. She had to think. She had to move. Her mind raced for an escape, a way out. Then, her gaze fell on the nearby window. The rain still poured outside, but the storm had slowed, the world dimming in the night. She had one shot, one chance. Her legs tensed, preparing for movement. The man was still speaking, his voice cold and mocking. "You've been digging for the wrong answers. But now..." He paused, savoring the moment. "Now you'll see what happens when you don't listen." With a sudden surge of adrenaline, Isabella twisted violently, throwing herself to the side. The knife scraped against her skin, but she was moving too quickly. She managed to roll out of reach, gasping for air. The man growled in frustration, stepping back. But Isabella didn't stop. She bolted to her feet, her body trembling with fear and desperation. Her mind screamed for her to run, but she knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. She glanced at the window again. Without thinking, she grabbed the chair from behind her and hurled it toward the glass. The sound of the chair shattering against the window echoed through the room. Isabella didn't wait. She leapt toward the broken glass, her heart pounding in her throat. The shards dug into her skin as she scrambled through the jagged opening, pain searing through her arms and legs. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The rain hit her face like needles as she dropped into the yard outside. She stumbled, almost falling, but she caught herself. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent. She could hear him still inside. The man. But she was free.
For now.
Her mind raced as she ran through the rain, her body slick and cold. The world around her was a blur. The storm had picked up again, but it didn't matter. She had to get away. She had to find help. She glanced over her shoulder once more. No sign of him. She kept running. Her breath burned in her chest, each step heavy. And then, just as her heart began to slow, a voice came, cutting through the night. A low whisper, carried by the wind. "You can't run from this, Isabella." Her blood ran cold.
She didn't stop.
But the words followed her, echoing in her mind, haunting her as she disappeared into the dark. There was no escaping it now. Not until the truth came out. But at what cost? Isabella's breath came in ragged bursts as she pushed herself through the night. The storm had swallowed the road ahead, the trees bending violently in the wind. But she couldn't afford to slow down. She had no idea where she was running to, only that she had to get away. She didn't look back. Every step felt like a battle against the darkness that threatened to overtake her. The rain lashed against her face, stinging her skin, but it didn't matter. She had to keep moving. The words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, "You can't run from this, Isabella." Asterisk. She tried to shake them off, but they felt real. Too real. The man's voice, his presence, still haunted her thoughts. She hadn't imagined it. She couldn't have. Her lungs burned, and the fatigue began to weigh on her, but she forced herself to keep going. She had to get to the road.
To safety.
The trees parted ahead, and she saw a faint light in the distance. A house? She squinted, focusing on the figure of what seemed like a car parked near the road. Asterisk people. There were people nearby. Help, asterisk. But as she moved closer, she noticed something strange. The light wasn't steady. It flickered, almost as if someone was playing with it. A chill crept down her spine. Was someone waiting for her? Was this part of the trap? She slowed her pace, cautious now. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back, to go the other way, but she couldn't stop. She had come this far. Isabella approached the car slowly, eyes darting around, scanning every shadow. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had to make sure. Was this a real place? Or was it another trick? The rain pounded harder, soaking her through. She reached the car. It was empty. The light flickered again, illuminating an old house behind it. The windows were dark. Empty. But there was something about it that didn't sit right with her. Her legs trembled as she took a step toward the house, and then another. It felt wrong. The air felt thick. The door to the house was slightly ajar. Isabella stopped, her breath shallow. She could almost hear something soft, deliberate steps, like someone pacing inside. Her eyes darted back to the road, but no one was there. She turned back to the house. A gust of wind blew through the trees, the darkness swallowing her. There was no turning back now. She had to know. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Was the truth here? Was it hiding inside this house? With trembling hands, Isabella reached for the door. It creaked open. The smell inside was musty, old wood, damp stone, and something else. Something she couldn't quite place. Her flashlight flickered again, its beam weak against the oppressive darkness. Each step she took made the floorboards groan under her weight. She moved cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the dark interior. There was no sign of life. Nothing but the silence. The house seemed abandoned. But as she moved deeper into the darkness, she could feel the weight of it. The tension in the air was palpable. And then she saw it. At the far end of the hall, in a shadowed corner, there was a door. A door she hadn't noticed before. It was cracked open just a little, as if inviting her in. She hesitated. Her heart raced as the door beckoned her closer. Was this the final piece? Her fingers brushed the edge of the doorframe, pushing it open slowly. The room beyond was dark, save for a faint, flickering light coming from a small lamp on the desk. And on the desk, a file. The same file. The one she had been looking for. Her pulse quickened. But as she reached for it, Her breath hitched in her throat. The room wasn't empty. A figure stood at the far corner.
Silent.
Waiting. Isabella froze. The man. It wasn't just the mask anymore. The figure in the corner had no mask. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. Empty. And yet, somehow, she knew who he was. The missing person. The one she had been searching for. Her mind whirled.
But there was no time to process it.
The door slammed shut behind her. The last thing Isabella heard before everything went dark was a voice. A familiar voice.
Soft.
Mocking. You should have stopped, Isabella. The darkness swallowed her whole. For a moment, there was only silence. The oppressive weight of it pressed against her chest. Isabella's eyes snapped open, but everything was a blur. Her head ached, a dull throb that echoed in her skull. She tried to move but found herself bound. Her hands were tied to a chair, wrists raw from the tight knots. Her heart pounded, each beat too loud in the stillness of the room. Her mind raced, but it was hard to focus. She had to escape. She had to get out. The room was small, dimly lit. Her eyes adjusted to the soft, flickering glow of a single lamp in the corner. The walls were bare, cracked, stained with age. But what made the room so chilling wasn't the state of decay. It was the smell. A mix of mildew and something else, something metallic. Her breath caught in her throat. The man. The missing person. She had seen him, hadn't she? Her pulse quickened as the memory hit her again. The file.
The desk.
The figure standing in the corner. It was him. It was impossible. She couldn't have been wrong. Her chest tightened as she looked around the room, hoping for a way out. But the door was locked. The windows were boarded up. She was trapped. And then she heard it. A soft shuffle. Footsteps. Slow. Calculated. She turned her head toward the sound, heart racing. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was him. The man. The same one she had seen outside. His face was pale, almost sickly, the same hollow eyes she had seen in the shadows. But it wasn't just his appearance that made her skin crawl. It was the way he moved. It was as if he knew exactly how to unsettle her. He approached her slowly, taking his time. And then, with a chilling calmness, he spoke. You really thought you could escape, didn't you? His voice was low, but it carried a weight of finality that made her stomach twist. She tried to speak, to scream, but the gag in her mouth muffled her words. Terror gripped her as he leaned closer, his breath cold against her ear. You shouldn't have dug so deep, Isabella. Now you've learned too much. Her eyes widened, her pulse pounding in her throat. The case. The missing person. The symbol. It all connected now. He wasn't just a victim. He was part of something much darker. Something she had barely begun to understand. He stepped back, his figure becoming a shadow in the dim light. I was hoping you'd stop. I really was, he said, almost to himself, as if he was disappointed. Then, he looked at her again, his hollow eyes piercing through the darkness. You should have listened to the warning. The door behind him slammed shut. And in that instant, Isabella knew. There was no way out. Not anymore. The walls seemed to close in around her, suffocating her in the cold, silent room. She couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. She was alone. And worse, she wasn't just trapped physically. Her mind raced, desperate to understand. The truth. What was the truth? Why had she been brought here? Why was she tied to this chair, held captive by the very thing she had been searching for? She didn't have the answers. And she didn't have much time left. The man moved closer, once more. His smile, if it could even be called that, was sickening. Welcome to the family, Isabella, he whispered. The air thickened. Her eyes widened as she realized the horrible truth. This was no accident. This was no simple case. She hadn't just stumbled into something dark. She had become a part of it. The truth wasn't waiting to be uncovered. It was waiting to swallow her whole. And it was too late to escape. Her heart raced, a frantic pulse that seemed to drown out all other sound. The cold, metal chair creaked beneath her as she struggled against the ropes, but it was no use. She was bound too tightly. The man's words echoed in her mind like a death sentence. Asterisk, welcome to the family, Isabella. Asterisk, what did he mean? Her mind screamed for answers, but her body was paralyzed with fear. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with an oppressive darkness that seemed to press against her chest, making it harder to breathe. She could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her ears, each beat louder than the last. The man stepped closer, his presence looming like a shadow. His eyes were empty, hollow, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She wanted to scream, to beg for help, but the gag in her mouth stopped any sound from escaping. The silence in the room was deafening, punctuated only by the sound of her ragged breath. What is this? She tried to think, to make sense of everything that had happened, but it all blurred together. Too many questions, too many pieces missing. Why had he brought her here? Why had he done this? The man reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of her jaw, cold and almost tender. Do you know who we are, Isabella? His voice was soft, almost kind, but it sent a shiver down her spine. Do you understand what you've stumbled into? Isabella's eyes widened. She shook her head as best as she could, desperate for answers, but he wasn't finished. He circled around her, his presence like a predator stalking its prey. No, you wouldn't understand. Not yet. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. He was enjoying this. The fear in her eyes. The panic in her breath. He thrived on it. The man stopped behind her, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then she felt it, cold fingers against her neck, and the unmistakable presence of something sharp. A knife. Her pulse spiked. She clenched her jaw, her body rigid with dread. You've been looking for answers. But some answers are better left hidden, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. What you don't realize is that you were never meant to uncover this. None of you were. Isabella's eyes darted around the room, seeking anything that could help her escape, but it was hopeless. The door was locked. The windows were sealed. She was trapped. And then, as if he could sense her thoughts, the man spoke again, his voice dripping with mockery. Do you think running away will save you? That your investigation will give you the truth? You're just a pawn. A tool. His words struck her like a slap in the face. Asterisk pawn? Tool? Asterisk. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of his words. He stepped in front of her now, kneeling down so that his face was level with hers. His eyes bore into her soul, empty but somehow suffused with something darker, something familiar. She recoiled, a shudder running through her body. And then, with a chilling calmness, he revealed it. The mark. The symbol. He pulled back the sleeve of his shirt, and there it was. A tattoo, black and intricate, a strange, looping design that seemed to pulse in the dim light of the room. Isabella's stomach turned. It was the same symbol she had seen in the case files. The same one linked to the missing persons case. And yet, it wasn't just a mark. It was a brand. A brand that symbolized something far more sinister. The man smiled again, that twisted, sick smile that never quite reached his eyes. You've uncovered the surface, Isabella, he said, his voice lowering to a cruel whisper. But the truth? It's buried much deeper than you think. Much deeper. Her chest tightened with the realization. She had been looking in the wrong place all along. The missing persons case wasn't the story.
She was. She had been the target all along.
The man's fingers brushed her cheek, and she recoiled, disgust rising in her throat. His touch was cold, like death itself. But don't worry, Isabella. You'll fit in perfectly, he continued, his voice almost gentle now. You're one of us. You just don't know it yet. Isabella's mind whirled as she tried to process his words. One of us? She was still trying to make sense of everything when the door behind him opened with a soft creak. Two more figures stepped inside. Isabella couldn't make out their faces in the dim light, but she could see the same tattoo, the same mark on their wrists. They moved toward her silently, as if they had rehearsed the motion 1,000 times. The man in front of her stepped aside. Prepare her, he said, his tone devoid of any empathy. Isabella's eyes widened, terror flooding her chest. "W, what are you doing?" she gasped, her voice barely audible through the gag. The man only smiled. "You'll understand soon enough." "Stop," she gasped, but it was useless. The gag silenced her voice. The figure's hands were gentle, almost tender as they brushed the hair from her face, but there was nothing kind about it. No warmth. No humanity. Just cold, calculated control. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, his lips close to her ear. "This is for your own good, Isabella. This is the beginning." Her blood ran cold. The blade pressed against her neck, just hard enough to send a searing jolt of pain down her spine. Everything in her screamed to escape, to break free. But there was nowhere to go. There was no one to save her. The figure raised the knife. Her heart skipped a beat. And then the door to the room swung open again, louder this time, echoing in the silence like the crack of thunder. Another man stepped in. He was tall, with broad shoulders, his features hidden behind a hood. But when he spoke, the air in the room shifted. "Enough." His voice was deep, commanding. The figures froze. Isabella could feel the change. The sudden shift in the atmosphere. Something about him was different. More powerful. The man in front of her lowered the knife slowly, his face twisted in frustration. "This is not the time," the newcomer said, stepping forward, his gaze locking with Isabella's. "You don't understand," the man closest to her replied, his voice shaking with anger. "She has to be prepared. It's the only way." The newcomer shook his head, his eyes cold.
"No.
"She's not ready. Not yet." Isabella's head spun. What was happening? The tension in the room was unbearable, thick with something ancient and unknowable. She couldn't process it all, couldn't understand the words they were speaking. But one thing was clear, there was a power struggle here. A battle of wills. And she was stuck in the middle of it. The newcomer turned his attention back to her, his eyes piercing through her, as though seeing everything at once. "You're not alone, Isabella," he said, his tone softer now, almost sympathetic. "But this isn't your fight yet." She didn't understand. But he was right about one thing. Her fight was coming. It was too late now. Isabella's head swam, her pulse racing, as she tried to make sense of the new arrival's words. The room felt impossibly small, like the walls were closing in around her, each breath a struggle against the crushing weight of confusion and fear. The figures in the shadows remained still, watching the man who had just entered. He was different. His presence was commanding, an unseen force radiating from him, but it didn't feel threatening, at least not in the way the others did. The man in front of her, the one who had been holding the knife, stepped back slightly, his eyes narrowing, clearly unwilling to relinquish control. But the newcomer didn't seem to notice. He simply stood there, his gaze never leaving Isabella's face. The silence stretched, unbearable, as the tension between the figures reached its peak. The man who had been closest to her, the one with the knife, finally spoke, his voice tight with restrained anger. "You don't get it, do you?" His words were clipped, almost venomous. "She's already too deep. You're too late." The newcomer's eyes didn't waver.
"No.
"It's never too late." His tone was firm, but not without a hint of sorrow. Isabella could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken truth in his words.
Too deep.
She didn't know what that meant, couldn't begin to grasp the horror of it. But something in the air had changed. The figure with the knife stepped forward again, but this time, the newcomer held up a hand, his palm open, and the room seemed to freeze in place. "She doesn't belong to you," the newcomer said softly, his voice like a low hum of power that resonated deep within her chest. The man in front of her clenched his fists. "You can't just—" "I can," the newcomer interrupted, his voice low but unmistakable in its command. For a moment, the two men faced off, their eyes locked, and Isabella could feel the energy between them, like an invisible force field just waiting to snap. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the tension broke. The man with the knife lowered it to his side, his face twisted with frustration. The newcomer took a slow step toward Isabella, his expression softening as he looked at her bound hands. "You don't know yet," But you're stronger than they think, he said quietly, as if to himself. Isabella didn't understand. Her thoughts were still jumbled, clouded by terror and confusion. Stronger? She couldn't make sense of it. The newcomer bent down, his movements deliberate and calm. His hand gently removed the gag from her mouth, and she gasped for air, feeling the immediate relief. But she couldn't speak. Words were too heavy, too tangled in her throat. Her body ached, and her mind raced. He didn't seem to mind her silence. He simply looked at her, as if he knew what she was thinking, what she was feeling. "You're going to need to trust me," he said softly. "I'll explain everything."
But not now. Not yet.
She wanted to scream. Explain? How could he expect her to trust him? She had been through hell already, and now this strange man, who had appeared from nowhere, was asking her to believe him? But his eyes, there was something in them. Something raw and understanding. He knew. He knew exactly what she had been through, and he knew what was coming. She tried to speak, but her voice was a raspy whisper. "Who are you?" she managed, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "What is this?" The newcomer's gaze hardened, and for a fleeting moment, Isabella thought she saw a flicker of regret pass over his features. "I'm not who you think I am," he said, standing up straight again. "But I'm here because I can stop this. I can stop them." She stared at him, her heart pounding. Stop them? How could he? "You can't stop what's already started," the man with the knife spat, his voice venomous. The newcomer turned to face him, the two men locking eyes again. "This is bigger than you," the newcomer said coldly, his voice low and steady. "Bigger than all of you. The ritual has already begun. But it's not too late. Not yet." Isabella's head spun. Ritual? What were they talking about? She tried to pull her hands free from the ropes again, but the man with the knife noticed and quickly stepped forward, pushing her back into the chair with a force that made her gasp. "Don't," he growled, his grip tight on her shoulders. The newcomer didn't flinch, but his expression hardened. "Enough." His voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable weight. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent standoff between these two men, one determined to keep her locked in this nightmare, and the other willing to risk everything to pull her out. Isabella's mind spun faster. Ritual? What ritual? Was this all some kind of twisted cult? Were they planning to use her for something? But before she could form another thought, the newcomer stepped forward again. This time, his hand reached down and gently touched the ropes that bound her. Without a sound, they fell away. Isabella's breath caught. Her hands were free, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Not yet. "Go," the newcomer said, his voice quiet but urgent. "Get out of here. Find the truth. Before it's too late." The words didn't fully register at first, but as he stepped back, she saw it, the faintest glimmer of something in his eyes. He wasn't just offering her freedom. He was offering her a chance to escape whatever nightmare had brought her here. A chance to survive. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get as far away as possible, but something held her in place. The man with the knife stepped forward again, a low growl escaping his throat. "You think you can stop this? You think you can take hers?" He was nearly spitting with rage now. But the newcomer didn't flinch. He stood his ground, meeting the man's fury with a cold, unyielding stare. "She's not your prisoner anymore," he said, his voice calm, but it was clear. This was a battle he intended to win. Isabella's body trembled, every muscle screaming to move, to run, but her mind was still caught in the labyrinth of confusion and fear. "Go," the newcomer repeated, his voice insistent. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Isabella did. She pushed herself up from the chair and staggered toward the door, her legs weak and trembling beneath her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. But as she stepped into the unknown, her thoughts echoed with the only words that seemed to matter now. She was no longer alone. The cold air hit her like a slap as she stepped into the hallway, her senses reeling from the shock. Every footstep seemed louder than the last, the sound of her shoes echoing down the narrow corridor. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. The fear still gripped her, wrapping around her throat like a vice, but something else was there now too. A faint, flickering flame of hope.
She had been given a chance.
She didn't know how much time she had before they realized she was free, but she couldn't stay here. Not for a second longer. The hallway stretched out before her, long and dimly lit, the walls cracked and worn, as if this place had been abandoned long ago. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft sound of her own breathing. But she kept moving. She had to move, one foot in front of the other. The door to the outside world was at the end of the hallway. She could see it now, barely illuminated by a flickering light. Almost there. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest, each beat a reminder of how close she was to freedom. But then a noise. A faint creak. A whisper. She froze. Her eyes darted to the side, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows. She exhaled slowly, willing herself to stay calm. It was just the house, the old building settling, nothing more.
But the feeling in the air had changed.
It was heavier now, more oppressive, as if something was waiting just out of reach, watching her every move. The door was closer. She could make it. Her fingers brushed the cool, rusted metal of the doorknob, and she paused. Think, Isabella, asterisk. She had no plan. No clear idea of what she was walking into. But one thing was certain. If she stayed here, if she went back into that room, she wouldn't survive. This place had already taken too much from her. She swung the door open, her breath catching in her throat as the light from the outside hit her eyes. For a split second, she hesitated, but then she stepped through. The night air hit her like a wave, and for a brief moment, she felt free. But freedom came with a price. The ground was uneven beneath her feet, the earth soft and wet. She stumbled, but caught herself. A low hum echoed from behind her. The door slammed shut. Isabella's heart raced as she turned, but there was nothing there. The building behind her stood silent.
Still.
Was it the wind? Or had someone followed her? She couldn't tell, but she couldn't afford to wait and find out. She turned away and sprinted into the night. The woods surrounded her like a thick, living wall. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches twisting and groaning, but she barely noticed. She ran, faster now, adrenaline fueling her every step, pushing her farther from that place, from those people. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how far she went, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something wasn't right. The deeper she ran into the forest, the darker it became. The trees seemed to close in around her, blocking out the moonlight, leaving her in an almost unnatural darkness. The shadows seemed to move, shift, stretch. She could hear them. Footsteps. Close behind her. A rustle in the underbrush. She wasn't alone. Isabella's breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed herself harder, her legs aching, her body screaming for rest. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The footsteps were closer now. Too close. A voice, faint at first, broke through the night air. Isabella. Her heart stopped. It was him. The man. The one who had spoken to her in that cold, dimly lit room. He was calling her name. She pushed herself harder, but the sound of his voice, so calm, so soothing, brought a cold, creeping dread over her. Don't stop. Don't look back, But her legs were giving out. She couldn't keep going forever. She stumbled again, this time falling to her knees in the dirt. She forced herself up, but before she could move again, she heard it. A soft rustling. Then, the unmistakable snap of a twig underfoot. She wasn't alone anymore. He was right behind her. The breath on her neck sent a shockwave through her body. Isabella. His voice was so close now, his presence looming behind her, the words like a poison, slipping into her mind. She froze. His breath was cold, colder than the night air, and his hand rested lightly on her shoulder. She tried to stand, to run, but his grip tightened, his fingers digging into her flesh. I told you, Isabella, he whispered, his voice almost affectionate. "You can't escape." She tried to scream, but his hand was on her mouth now, muffling her cries. It was over. The darkness around her thickened, swallowing the last remnants of her hope. Her vision blurred. Her body trembled. She was caught. She was trapped. And just like that, she understood. There was no running. No escaping. She had been a part of this story all along. The family. The ritual. The dark truth. She was the missing piece. And now, there was no going back. Her body went still, suspended in that moment between fear and realization. The man's grip on her shoulder was unyielding, his presence like a shadow that had always been a part of her, always lingering just out of sight. She could feel his breath now, cold and deliberate against her skin, and it filled her lungs with a sense of finality. "I told you, Isabella," he whispered, his voice low, soft, and yet laced with something far darker, something ancient. "You can't escape." She tried to fight the fear, tried to push away the dread that crept up her spine, but it was like her body had forgotten how to move. Her thoughts were clouded, her limbs heavy, as though the weight of this revelation had anchored her in place. Her mind screamed for release, for some shred of hope, but there was nothing left. No more escape routes. No more places to hide. "You think this was a mistake," he continued, his words caressing her ear like a sick lullaby. "No. This was always the plan. You've been running toward this moment your whole life." Isabella's heart slammed in her chest. The plan? What was he talking about? The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with a sickening clarity, each fragment she'd uncovered in the investigation falling into place. Her search had never been about the missing people. It had always been about her. She wasn't just the journalist chasing a story.
She was the story.
Her pulse raced, but she couldn't pull away. She was too frozen, too caught in the web of his words. The silence of the night pressed in on her, wrapping her in an inescapable cocoon. "The symbol," he murmured. "It's yours. It was always meant for you. You're one of us, Isabella. You've been part of the family all along." Isabella shook her head, her mind recoiling from the idea. But deep down, a seed of truth began to sprout, something she had always felt but couldn't understand. The mark, the missing people, the whispers in her nightmares, they weren't coincidences. She had always belonged, and now there was no turning back. He turned her slowly, facing her toward the darkness beyond the trees. The forest loomed like an endless void, but in it, she saw the others, figures emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim moonlight. They were waiting. For her. The man smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll understand soon, Isabella. We've all been waiting for you." Her breath caught in her throat as the darkness closed in, and the last piece of her shattered world fell into place. She had been chosen.
She was one of them now.
And as she stepped forward into the waiting night, the truth settled over her like a heavy cloak. There was no escape. The air felt still, almost too still, as Isabella stood at the edge of the forest, the figures around her silently watching. Their eyes glimmered in the dark, their faces unreadable, but she knew, deep down, what they were, what they had been waiting for. It wasn't just her survival. It wasn't just her curiosity that had led her here. It had always been her, even before she knew it, that had been at the center of all of it. The missing people, the cryptic messages, the symbols she had uncovered, they had all pointed to this moment. The weight of that truth settled over her like a stone, cold and heavy, but not unwelcome. The fear, the uncertainty, it faded. Slowly, she began to understand that there had never been a choice. She was part of something older, something ancient, and perhaps she had always been destined to be. "Welcome home." The man's voice was soft behind her, but his words carried the weight of eternity. He stepped into the circle of light, his eyes never leaving hers, his presence like a magnet that pulled her in, made her feel anchored to something beyond herself. "I never understood," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the wind, but she felt a deep recognition in his gaze. "I didn't know who I was." He nodded, his lips curling into a half-smile. None of us do at first. But we're not meant to. We're not meant to remember until the time is right. Her thoughts flickered to the investigation, the countless nights spent chasing shadows, the pieces of the puzzle she had never known how to put together. She thought of the people she had met along the way, the fragments of their lives intertwined with her own, and she realized it didn't matter now. They were all part of the same story. As the figures closed in around her, there was no fear, no desperation to run. It was as if the darkness had finally opened to reveal the truth she had spent so long searching for. Isabella had always been part of this family, part of this unspoken covenant, and now she was finally ready to accept it. Her breath steadied, her heart slowed. She took the first step forward, embracing the unknown. And as she did, the world around her seemed to breathe with her, alive, ancient, waiting. The night was no longer something to fear. It was home. And in that moment, Isabella knew that she had found where she truly belonged.